I never imagined my life would begin again at a funeral, my husband's funeral. Robert and I had been married for 40 years. Ours wasn't a passionate marriage, but I believed it was solid, built on loyalty and quiet understanding. He worked, I stayed home, raised our son Daniel, and kept our world in order. That was the deal. When he died suddenly in a car accident, brakes failed on a rainy morning, the doctor said he didn't suffer. I wasn't sure he deserved such an easy death. That morning at the chapel, I wore his favorite charcoal gray coat and stood by the door greeting guests. The wind bit through the wool, and my fingers were stiff from cold, but I smiled anyway. Even in death, I was keeping up his appearances. Daniel, our only child, stood at the podium in a crisp black suit. He was 33, tall, confident, everything we'd raised him to be. His voice was steady as he spoke about his father's discipline, his hard work, his principles. And then, with a pause so long I could hear my own heartbeat, he said, "There's someone I want to thank especially, someone who stood by my father through his hardest times, Miss Linda Mallister." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. Then I saw her. She stood in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Perfect hair, perfect dress, perfect tears. Everyone turned to look at her. And me, the real wife, sat off to the side, invisible. Linda Mallister. The name hit me like an echo from an old nightmare. Robert's former assistant. The woman he once called just a competent employee. People whispered around me, "She's sitting so close, like family." And then Daniel said it, the words that gutted me. She was the one who was truly family to us. I felt the world tilt beneath me. My own son, thanking my husband's mistress at his father's funeral. When the lawyer read the will a week later, the betrayal was complete. Robert had left everything, the house, the vacation property, even the savings, to Linda. Not a cent to me. I sat frozen, unable to breathe. Daniel didn't even flinch. He just nodded, calm, composed, as if he already knew. Afterward, I confronted him. "You knew?" I whispered. He hesitated. Dad had his reasons. What reasons? 40 years of marriage meant nothing? He met my eyes and said quietly, "She understood him, Mom. You didn't." That was the moment I realized I hadn't just lost my husband. I'd lost my son too. That night, I sat alone in our empty living room. Robert's chair was still in its place at the dining table. The air still smelled faintly of his cologne. There were bottles of his favorite beer in the fridge, beer I never even liked but always bought for him. I opened an old photo album and saw the younger version of us, laughing, hopeful, before I traded my career for a promise that he'd take care of me. All that love, all that patience, buried with him. But the truth was still alive, and it was waiting to be found. The next morning, I went to the lawyer's office again. I asked for a copy of the will, and as he handed it to me, I noticed the date signed 3 years ago. Around the same time, Robert began taking more business trips. I went home and searched through his drawers, receipts, letters, one envelope from the Nantucket Property Management office addressed not to Robert, but to Linda. My hands trembled. That house by the sea, where we'd once spent summers together, he had transferred it to her. I walked to my neighbor Giselle's that afternoon. She was a sharp old widow who saw everything. When I mentioned Linda's name, her eyes flickered. "Oh, that woman? She was always with Robert. I thought you knew. They put up Christmas lights together one year when you were sick." I remembered that Christmas. Robert had told me a neighborhood boy helped him. I went home shaking. The lies had been layered so carefully I'd lived inside them for decades. That night, in the basement, I found an old cardboard box of company photos. And there he was, Robert, his hand gently resting on Linda's arm. His smile radiant, easy, youthful, a smile he'd never once given me. In one picture, Daniel stood beside them, barely 19. There was writing on the back, "Our little family will be official one day." That was the moment something inside me shattered. But grief turned to resolve. I called my old friend Ruth, a retired financial analyst who once worked with me at Robert's firm. "Ruth," I said, "I think he used company funds to buy Linda her properties." There was silence. Then Ruth replied, "You're not just chasing ghosts, Maggie. You're chasing fraud." We agreed to meet 2 days later. While waiting, I began digging through public property records. Linda owned a villa purchased 5 years ago, right when Robert had overseen an employee housing project. I remembered joking, Next time, take me too. He'd laughed it off. When I met Ruth, she handed me her laptop. Look at this, she said. There were 3 payments labeled external consulting support. No real company. No office. A shell account, Linda's shell account. $50,000. Transferred the month I was recovering from surgery. I didn't even blink. I'm going to expose her. The following week, I met with a corporate lawyer named Michelle Robinson. Sharp, professional, calm. I told her everything. Send me all your files, she said. We'll build the case. That night, I gathered 50 documents, receipts, photos, emails, and labeled a folder evidence. Months passed in a blur of court filings, statements, and interviews. Linda denied everything, her lawyer painting her as a devoted assistant. She even produced fake invoices to justify the payments. But Ruth's records told the real story. I took the stand, trembling but unbroken, and told the court about 40 years of marriage built on sacrifice and silence. I told them about Linda, the woman who'd smiled at me while stealing my life. The judge, a woman with kind but knowing eyes, listened carefully. In the end, she ruled in my favor. Linda was ordered to repay every cent, over $1 million with interest. She lost her job, her reputation, and the properties she'd built from my husband's lies. When the verdict was read, she turned to me, her face pale and empty. For the first time, she had nothing to hide behind. Daniel didn't speak to me for a long time after that. He called me vindictive. He said I'd destroyed his father's memory. But time has a way of softening illusions. Years later, when Daniel became a father himself, he called me. His voice was quieter, humbler. Mom, he said, can we talk? We met at the same cafe we used to visit when he was little, the one where he'd always order caramel pudding. He looked older, tired. I didn't understand back then, he said. I was angry, but I was wrong. You were right about Dad. I'm sorry. I smiled through tears. You were defending the only version of him you knew, Daniel. I don't blame you. At that moment, I realized I'd finally gotten back what mattered most. Not the money, not the house, my son. A year later, I hosted a small garden party, just close friends. Daniel and his wife. The air smelled of lilacs. Laughter floated across the yard. I stood by the crabapple tree I'd planted 20 years earlier. Last year, this tree almost died, I said. I thought about cutting it down. But this spring, it bloomed brighter than ever. The women smiled. I added softly, even what's hurt can bloom again, if you give it time. That night, after everyone left, I folded up the chairs and stood alone on the porch. The wind chimes swayed, and the sunset brushed gold across the maple trees. I took off my shoes, stepped inside, and whispered to the empty room. I know who I am now. I'm not the invisible wife anymore. I'm not someone's shadow or sacrifice. I am Maggie Smith, a survivor, a woman reborn from betrayal, and free at last.